Rosa Sarmento empowers mission-led women leaders to launch binge-worthy podcasts to amplify their message and scale their impact and income through her business Ideablossoms. In this episode, we chatted all about podcasting and how to make it manageable for different people, as well as how private podcasts can act as a lead generator, an email list incentive, or addition to an offer. Even if you don't have a podcast or plan to in the future, I hope this conversation can give you insights as to how you can approach different marketing platforms in a way that suits you. Welcome to the podcast, Rosa. I'm so excited to chat with you.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here, truly.
Yeah, amazing. So to kick us off, tell us about you and your business and everything that you do.
Of course. That's the part that I'm very awkward with because I'm an introvert. So bear with me. So I'm Rosa. I am the founder of Ideablossoms, which is a boutique podcast agency for women, especially women leaders and thought leaders. And yeah, we basically help them launch, manage, grow their podcast. We do everything: editing, publishing, repurposing it, marketing it. It all depends on the client, really, but that's what we love to do. And I'm originally from Brazil, now living in Mexico, married to an American. It's very messy. But yeah, that's my life in a nutshell.
First off, what I kind of wanted to start off with was I'm recording a bunch of podcasts this week. We're like batching everything. But basically, for anyone who's listening, in the episodes that have gone out live over the last, 4 to 6 weeks, we've talked a little bit about podcasting. And every time I mention it, I'm like, and the requirements that you would have to do to like edit it and all of these things. So obviously there is the option that you outsource all of that. And delegate it partially so that you have the time, but also just the brain space so that you don't have to think about it, worry about it, all of those things. So I'm really excited to dive into how all of that works. So where do you start off with your clients? Like where's the starting point where each of them comes to you with? Are they just like, I want to have a podcast and I don't really know what I want it to be about? Or is it mostly like they have a podcast for a while and then they start working with you?
Well, we have two types of clients. We have the clients that have an idea for their podcast. They want to help with launch because they have been procrastinating and planning and dreaming for like months, sometimes years. I've heard years. And it's just like the tech part and figuring things out and knowing where to start. It starts to get overwhelming. So they get paralyzed and they just push and never happens. So that's one client that we have. They're just like, enough is enough. We're launching this, and they get help. So we help them, and they can just focus on recording, really, because we take care of everything else. We create the cover, the description, the setup, the editing, the show notes, even the marketing. We take care of it. If you're launching with us, we'll take care of the marketing as well. So it's really just like that weight lifted from their shoulders. They don't have to figure anything else anymore. They just have to record their episodes. And usually when they come to us, they have a very clear idea of what the podcast is about, who it is for. Otherwise, I wouldn't even take them as a client because if there's no point in launching a podcast if you don't know what's about and who it is for. That's like the number one thing, by the way. If you're thinking about a podcast, number one thing, really get a clear vision for it, what like who it is, who it's for, what's it about, topics you want to bring, guests you want to bring if you're going to have guests. Having that clear vision will help a lot. But we also have clients that come to us. They already get launched. They've been doing this for a while, but they usually been doing this either by themselves or they've had a podcast manager or a virtual assistant, but for some reason it didn't work out and they're looking for someone that's a better fit, basically.
Yeah, cool. And I mean, so I personally edit my own podcast, but I will need to let go of the reins at some point. I'm just in that phase of like still trying to figure out all the different tweaks I'm making. So I don't want to inflict those changes on somebody else.
I honestly think that's good. Like, I love when podcasters come to me and they understand the behind the scenes. They understand everything that goes into it. They know what they want because like those are the best clients. They know exactly what they want. They like the editing, the show notes, every little thing. So it's so easy to work with them. It's like the best clients ever.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And I was thinking yesterday because somebody had posted on Threads about like any tips for someone who's starting a podcast. And I think the three things I said were think about how you want the podcast to make people feel. Like, what are they showing up for? What are they getting out of it? Like, what kind of, because that will lead what kind of topics you do, what kind of guests you have if you're having guests. And then the second thing was think about how much time you're going to spend on it. Are you going to outsource it or edit it and stuff yourself? Because you don't want to end up where it kind of like takes over everything else and then everything else slips. And
Mm-hmm.
then thirdly was how are you going to market it? Like how are you going to have discovery for the podcast? And it was kind of like in that order. Because it's like figure out what you want
Yeah.
the show to be, how you're going to make it work into your business. Like, okay, do you need to wait a couple months and finish off a certain amount of projects, or are you going to outsource as much of it as possible so that it's not as much of a burden on you? And then also how are you going to market it? I think sometimes when people think about having a podcast, they think of like having a top 50 podcast. And so they're
Mm-hmm.
potentially thinking first about how am I going to market it? Because how am I going to get X number of listeners? Where I think in this space of where podcasting is at, but also if you want your podcast to lead people back to your business, like if you're podcasting for business,
Mm-hmm.
then oftentimes that marketing is important, but it's what do you want those topics and stuff to be about? Is there any kind of different approach that you take your clients through of what they should consider before you start so that that way you are on the right path with like managing their podcast?
I think approach is a great word to use here because when you're starting a podcast, it's so important to have that at least an idea of what kind of approach you want to have. Some people call it a niche. That can be your approach. But I think it's important to understand like what's what can you bring to the table basically. Like how is this going to help in like how is this going to help the listeners, but also how it's going to stand out from the crowd? Because, everything is, I mean, people to say that podcasting is saturated, but everything is saturated. Let's be honest. Like, there are so many business about so many things and all the platforms. Everything is saturated. So, like, what is your unique approach? How do you do things differently? What listeners can expect from each and every one of the episodes? I have a client and she stands from all the other clients in terms of numbers. And I just I had to stop and think like what is it about her that brings all those downloads and all these people? And on top of being, of course, consistent and having good quality, she's also very niched and she has a very unique approach on her services and how she delivers them. For instance, she offers hormone balance services remotely. So it's very specific. Everything's around hormones and everything, of course, for women. So she talks about energy, periods. So it's very, very, very specific. And she has an approach on how to quote unquote solve those issues. First of all, discover why you're having those issues and then approach it from a holistic point and try to actually get it not fix is a bad word, but how to get it right without having to resort to medicine or to not non-natural resources. So yeah, I think that's really what the success is really about. Like she's honed in so much on what she does, who she serves, and how she serves them. It just keeps like building and building every month. I check her reports and it's insane. So I think like having a different approach is so important. And I know it can be intimidating. Actually, that's a better word. It can be intimidating. Like, how am I going to stand out? What's my different approach? But it will also make you stand out so much.
Yeah, no, that's so true. And yeah, even that thing of like what kind of phrasing there for like the hormonal health. I don't know whether it's the SEO person in me, but I love optimizing my health. That's the thing of like, how can I improve this? I'm not trying to like have the perfect health, but yeah, I can see how that resonates with so many people. It can be a niche topic, but also there's no like ceiling on it because, you know, half the population in theory goes through that at some point in their life, has some kind of hormonal thing that they need to be considering. But it's very specific instead of just being general health, so that it's like how, okay, so some episodes might be relevant to me, some wouldn't, but because it's niched, all episodes would be relevant to me, you know. Yeah, so I really like that of yeah, it might not compete on the podcast charts, but in terms of, you know, numbers and dedicated people who will listen to every episode and people who care about the topic, is so much more, you know, beneficial than, you know, being in some arbitrary number situation. So I love that.
And the most surprising thing is that she is on the charts.
Amazing. I love that.
And I think that's the power of really niching down with your podcast. People think that it's going to do the opposite. Like you're going to get less downloads because it's so specific. But it really isn't. Like when you tune into a podcast, at least me, and I think most people I know and I work with, you are searching for something. And it's usually something specific. You don't want a broad, whatever topic. No, you're tuning in because you are looking for an answer for something, or you want to be entertained by a certain topic, but you have a goal there. People have a goal. They're not just wasting time. So to think about that, to think about what's your listener's goal and honing in on that, really making your episodes about that, that is the key.
Yeah. And also just the point of like, you do the marketing work or whatever to get a listener for an episode. If your podcast is consistently around the same topic, then they're more likely to listen to multiple episodes rather than if you were like bopping around between different topics and all different formats and all of these different things. Then often over the course of like say 10 episodes, maybe 1 or 2 will be relevant to them, and so therefore those numbers that contribute to like that consistency, but also any kind of chart or like moving the needle for your business kind of situation
100%
comes from that like dedication in a way, and like the continued value that you bring to them in a way. Like if you think of a radio show, they are similar day to day. They talk about different things, but you know, maybe you're listening to a certain type of music station and the DJs are talking about certain different topics, but it's reasonably consistent. They're not just like one day talking about one thing and then are on the opposite end of like who people would be, like one, like if they say they're political or something, they're going to stick to one kind of lane. So yeah, that makes sense. And making sure that it's working. But I just love that because of that niche, and potentially obviously because of like who the host is, and I'm sure they're like charismatic and all of those things, that the numbers are really reflecting that. So that's awesome to hear.
Yeah, and she's very objective too. There's no fluff, there's no ranting. It's like, let's talk about this today. Dun-dun-dun. This is what we're going to talk about. She listed, which is, I think it's very helpful too. Like at the very beginning of the episode, she sets the expectation. Like today we're going to talk about this, and we are covering this and this and that. So right from the bat, people know, oh, okay, this is an episode I want to tune into. And even like her consumption rate is good. If people don't know what a consumption rate is how much people actually stay on that episode, how much they listen from that episode. It can be 50%, so they drop halfway through the episode. Or it can be 100%, which means they have listened to the whole thing every little second. And her consumption rate is also a reflection of that. Like at the very beginning, people know this is for me or this is not, which is totally fine if it's not. And they know what to expect. They know what they're going to learn. She sticks to, you know, the plan. She sticks to the topics. And I see the reviews. It's like, it's very clear. It's very easy to understand and to grasp. And it's very also like applicable, easy tips that people don't feel like, oh my gosh, like I'm never going to be able to do that. Like I'll have to change my whole life, my lifestyle, blah, blah, blah. No, it's like practical tips. You can start right away today. easy, baby steps. And like those are the things people really, I think people are looking for on a podcast. It's not like you're expecting to get an MBA from an episode.
Yeah.
You just want to get something out of it, like a little thing that can help you today or, on the next week, this month. That's what I do, at least.
Yeah. I also love podcasts for like inching me into a topic where like if I watched something that was like too highly technical, it would probably just be overwhelming information for me because I wouldn't know the jargon or whatever. And so I love podcasts of like being that introduction to something where they break things down into really small bite-sized chunks for me so that over time, whether I'm binging the episode or listening on a week-to-week basis, that I'm learning something, but not in a way that is like super taxing for my mind. So I love that.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. And then there's private podcasting. So tell us about how that's different to like having a publicly listed podcast, and also like maybe the motivations behind why you would do that differently.
From where I see it in my experience, it's very clear how they're different, right? A public podcast is a podcast that most people are familiar with. You go to Apple Podcasts or Spotify, you browse through them, you tune in, you choose the episodes you want to listen to. It's easy to find them. You can share on social media, all of the stuff. A private podcast is it's private. You can only access through a link, and that link belongs to the host. So the host can share with whoever they want. And most people are like, but why would you do that? People wouldn't be able to find your podcast. What's the point? The goal is very different. For public podcasts, people are usually looking for authority, credibility, visibility. So it makes a lot of sense to have a public podcast. For private podcasts, the goals are different. It's usually around selling a certain service or offer, getting leads into their email list, because, to get access to that podcast, that private podcast, they have to sign up. Then they get a link, they can tune into the podcast, and they can learn a very specific thing. Private podcasts are usually short and sweet, like 5 episodes, 10 episodes, talking about a certain topic, or teaching on a certain topic, a training. So yeah, it's really great for you it's like a low entry point to your world. If you're a service provider, if you're a coach, you can have a little private podcast that teaches them on something. And it's a really good idea if you teach them on the foundations that they need to continue working with you. So you're not only getting those leads, you're preparing them to take that next step with you. And also there are other things you can do, like private courses. Now they're starting to offer like a private feed, a podcast feed, where they can, just listen to the lessons, or they have a Q&A session every week, and that gets uploaded into a private podcast that people can tune into in their own time. People do this for virtual summits now. So instead of like watching the presentations, you can listen to them on the go, because let's face it, we're all busy. We don't have time to watch hours and hours of videos in front of a computer. So that's how a private podcast can be very helpful to your business. It can bring leads, it can bring sales, it can develop a more intimate relationship with your students or your clients. Because if they're busy, if they don't have time, if they don't want to sit in front of a computer to watch that video or that training, they can just listen on their phone on the way to work, washing dishes, at the gym. For me, it's at the gym. That's where I listen to my podcasts.
Yeah. Yeah, no, and that makes perfect sense. I think the thing that I have seen the most commonly used for is like maybe like a Patreon situation. So like you pay maybe not just to get the podcast, but you pay for a bunch of things, and then the podcast is one of those things. And sometimes that's like that you get the podcast 6 months early or 3 months early or whatever. And the episodes will be eventually released. And I guess maybe if they have guests and things like that, that's a bonus for them, is that eventually it will become public. But you get it earlier. Other times it's, like a private podcast feed of recordings of networking calls or a group coaching program call, but you're able to access it audio based, so that you can either re-listen if you attended, or that you can listen without attending, and you don't need to watch, because oftentimes whatever's on the screen is just people's faces anyway. So like it allows you to be movable and like listen to it in the car, at the gym or whatever, without having like a video downloaded to your phone. And it allows people to have those entry points. So you're still able to access this podcast on like Apple Podcasts and things like that, but it's just that you have to have the link. But what I haven't seen, and what I really hope I see more of, is that using it as an email lead, like a email list generator, of having a one-off set of foundational pieces of information that people can use. And I think that's so beneficial for businesses where maybe people listen to that series and then they go on to listen to your podcast, or that maybe throughout the course of your business and how you deliver your services, they will be speaking to you, or there's some kind of like trust or authority required there. Because it can be so much more personal to listen to someone's voice than it is to even just read an email, for example.
I have actually 2 clients who did both, actually. The private podcast was like a mini audio course, but at the same time, they released like 1 episode or the first 3 episodes for free as a lead generation. And then if they wanted to continue listening and continue doing the course, they could purchase the private podcast and get like lifetime access to it. They can listen on Apple, Spotify, you name it. So I thought that was really smart. Like we did both, the paid private podcast, but also leverage it, the same material. It didn't cost them anything extra. The same episode, we just released 1, 2, or 3 for free as a freebie, as a free resource, as a lead generation tool to bring people into their world, to nurture them, because like once you get that email, nurture sequences, all the good stuff. And it's worked really well. It's evergreen now, so they have an evergreen funnel to bring people in, to nurture them, to convert them. And then they also set that foundational piece, like I said before. They now understand what their work is about. They got a feel of what they are, like who they are as a leader or as a coach or as a mentor. So I think that's a really, really smart strategy that I've applied with a few clients. There are coaches, and it's worked wonders, because it is a big commitment to, it's usually high ticket. You're usually committing to 3, 6, 12 months with this one person that you don't know much about. You've read the emails and saw the social posts, but like, how would it be like to really work with them? So that's a really good way of doing that, I think, with that, like a little private feed, a little training or course. They can get a taste of what you are, your approach, how you do things. And then they can choose if continuing doing this work with you makes sense or if it doesn't.
Yeah. I'm even thinking how this could be really beneficial for me, because if I kept the podcast interviews, right, there's only so much people are hearing about me and my approach because I'm interviewing people about their approach. But if I can have, even if it's free, but it's via my email list, a series of episodes that are kind of like foundational to set people up so that if they were to hire me for one of my strategy or coaching packages, they've already gotten to a certain point, so that some things that are often seen as like the basics, that I'm not spending the time on those calls going through those things where I could have just, then I'm telling every client these basics when I could have just recorded one podcast episode about them and delivered them to them once. It also can be really helpful if you have like a wait list or something as well. I can see like, okay, you're doing maybe like a group coaching, or you're fully booked for coaching, or some kind of other service, you're fully booked and you want to prep your clients. You've booked them in maybe in advance, or they're waiting for doors to open to some course or offer that you have. It's something to give them in the meantime so that they can start and keep working off that momentum, rather than, it may be going flat and then you needing to get back in touch with them, or them needing to get back into the mindset of whatever thing they've signed up for. So that makes perfect sense as well. Next, I'd love to talk about who business owners are sharing those private podcasts with, and also like how are they managing that? Is it like, because it's a one and done link, is it just super simple, something that they're delivering to people, or are there like any other technical things that people need to think about as they think about potentially doing a private podcast?
Well, you will need a podcast host that allows for private feeds. That's very important. There are many podcast hosts out there, but not all of them will give you a private feed. They will give you the public feed, which is the one that everyone's going to get access to, but you don't want that because you want people to opt in or you want people to pay you to get access to that podcast, right? So a good one that I like to use that's very user friendly, so if you're not tech savvy, totally fine, is Hello Audio. And another very good one is Captivate. And Captivate has like amazing stats. So if you're like a data person, you're definitely going to want to go with Captivate. Because you're going to need a podcast host, period. And it needs to have that private feed. And once you set up that private feed, it's really ready to go. You get the link, the private link, and then you can set up an automation. So people, as soon as they opt in, they get an email with a link. That's the link they have to click to get to the private podcast. Simple as that. And there are also some features, like you can give people access for a certain amount of days. So it expires after 90 days. So people take action, right? Because otherwise it just sits there and they never listen. I think that's a great idea, giving them like, hey, here's a private podcast. Enjoy. You have X days, just to make sure they really go through the episodes. You can also drip content it depends really on your strategy and what you're trying to do with the private podcast, but you can drop all the content at once and they can binge through the 10 episodes or whatever, or you can slowly drip them like a normal podcast would. So there are some really cool features you can explore, but really, if you want to keep it simple, and I would, if you're not into the tech savvy things, keep it simple. That's always a good way to go. So just set it up, get the link, automate that email so they get it as soon as they opt in, and you're good to go.
Yeah, perfect. And then I think something that can be super intimidating about podcasts, either public or private, is how do you get started? Like, what do you need to consider? And when it was me starting, I was like, yeah, but I hate the sound of my own voice. And then a lovely friend of mine who is American said, Emma, your accent is so amazing. I could listen to you read the like terms and disclosures on like medical ads if you wanted to. And I was like, oh, okay, so cool. It's just that I hate the sound of my own voice. Maybe not everyone else does.
I think everyone hates the sound of their own voice. I sound so nasally. I don't know if that's a word. I hate it, but that's what we're working with.
Yeah, there's also the thing that your voice sounds different to you than it does like being played back to you. So there's also that thing that you have to get used to of like, why do I sound like that? That's weird. Are there any kind of like confidence boosters, things that people should maybe not worry quite so much about? I mean, obviously the first thing is if you're worried about video, obviously podcasting is so open to just being audio, so you don't have to do any kind of video format. But any other kind of things that you find that people need to, I don't know if get over just sounds so like harsh, but like work through, shall we say? There's some things they need to work through to get their confidence up to get into podcasting.
Well, I have two things to say, really. Don't overthink. Stop. Just stop. Make a decision. Go. You can change. Nothing's set in stone. Things are going to evolve. That's a certainty. That's a fact. It's not going to stay the same. It would be weird if you had a podcast for years and years and it's still the exact same thing it was when you first started. So don't overthink things. Make a decision and then go with it and stick with it for a certain amount of time, because it's podcasting, right? And you need time, you need consistency to see results. So don't be impatient with the results, but be patient with your actions. I heard this from a mentor once, and I'm like, that makes a lot of sense. So being patient with your actions, but then be patient with the results. Make a decision, go with it. If it doesn't feel good after 3 or 6 months, then make a little tweak here and there. You want to experiment something new? Let's try it. See how it goes. It's your podcast. It's your podcast. You make the rules. You can do it. And another thing is, forget about the shoulds and the have-tos that you listen to out there. That's why I try to be very careful with like, you should do this. because there are so many ways of doing things, and podcasting is still so new. So I think saying anything like you should, it's silly and stupid. We don't even know much about podcasting. Like the industry itself is still evolving. There's so much we still need to, improve if you compare it to YouTube or Google or Instagram. No, we have a long way to go. So forget about those shoulds and have tos. Like if you're putting a lot of pressure on yourself to do things, to do a certain thing because you should do this and because you heard it, you have to launch with 3 episodes because that's what they say you have to. And like it just piles up, and that's where the overwhelm comes from. There's so much overwhelm that comes from those have tos. So forget about that. Really tune in into what you want, what is your goal, your listeners, what do they need, what are their goals. That is really the important thing. And everything will come from those answers. So that's where it all starts. Why do you want to start this? Who are you doing this for? What do they need? What do they want from you? And that's where everything comes from. Like the idea for the podcast, the episodes, the guests you're going to bring on. That's like, if you have those answers, you have your podcast. It's just a matter of making the decisions. Don't overthinking things, especially the podcast name, because that's the number one thing people get stuck with. Don't overthink it and just go with it.
Yeah, no, I love that. I think even my own language, how I talk about things, I've really changed because sometimes people will listen to something that I say and think of it as like almost like a prescription of this is how you should do your marketing. So I've even started saying things like I can only say should if it is immediately followed up by like consider. So you should consider X. Otherwise it's like could
idea.
try and all of those kind of phrases instead of like you should do this, because as we can see, as everything grows, and I mean, even podcasting being so like global is how it can feel saturated. But realistically, there are so many different ways of doing everything. There are different ways of approaching every single platform. And therefore, like you do have options and you can make it work for you if you decide that that modality is something that you really want to try. And then also the things of like, how can you make this possible for you? How can you make it like the minimum viable product of how a podcast would look for you? So would it be audio? So therefore audio only. So then it doesn't matter what you look like, what space you're in. Are you in the literal closet or something? I don't know. Like it doesn't really matter because you're not worrying about lighting or any of those kind of things. Also, I got really hung up, and I don't know if I've just gotten better at like editing sound or whatever, or maybe my house or something, but like even the slightest noise outside, you could hear it in the background, and I have upgraded my microphone in that time as well, so maybe that was the thing. But I would get really hung up on like how it sounds because of all of these things, and what if people are listening to it in their car and whatever. So I've made like slight adjustments, but like having something like this microphone is not required. When I have guests on, I'm often saying to them like the Apple wired in, like plugged in headphones are actually really good. You just have to make sure that they're not scratching on your hair or whatever. Because you don't need to spend like $400 US on a microphone and an audio interface just to be able to have a podcast. Like, no. Because also most of these things weren't even accessible when podcasts started. Like there were no podcast specific microphones. And like if they were like super industry, for radio hosts. So they weren't accessible. So it's just like, how can you make this possible for you? There are certain like recording tools out there. And also like Spotify recently acquired, it just slipped out of my head. What are they called? But now it's called Spotify for podcasters. So they have all of these accessible
Anchor,
tools.
Right?
Anchor, that's it. So they acquired this tool that helps you to record, edit, and release your podcast. And now they've kind of like padded that out with a few extra things. So compared to even like 5 years ago, there are so many more tools out there that make it super simple for you, which also means that there are free tools because a lot of them have the free plan. And then it's just signing up for the right one so that hopefully you don't have to transfer, although you can if you want to do something like a private podcast in the future. So you're making sure that you're on the platform that has the different features that you want so that you don't end up having to plug 3 things together to make it work, basically. But yeah, and then unfortunately you just have to try it and see what happens.
I think that's the thing. It's doing something new, and that scary feeling of doing something new and uncomfortable. That's why I say don't overthink it, because if you think about it too much, you're just going to talk yourself out of it. Just
Yes.
go with it. Try, see what happens. And if like launching a public podcast sounds very intimidating and overwhelming, it's a big commitment. Like we know it takes consistency, so it's not a thing you're gonna do for a month or two. It's gonna take a few months if you're serious about it, and then you can assess if it's working or not. But you can make an assessment in a month or two. But if that's overwhelming, then start with a private podcast. Have fun with those like 5, 6, 10 episodes. Put them out there, get some leads and some sales, and then see also like how does that feel? Dip your toes into the podcasting habits and see how that feels. Do you enjoy recording? Did you actually have a great time? Because I have clients, they're like, I'm actually enjoying this very much. I wish I had done it sooner. Because you never know. You never know until you try.
Yeah. Yeah. And another thing that I suggest to people is trying as a guest on podcasts first, because
Yes.
then it can, once you book that spot to be interviewed by someone, you have a deadline. So it helps you to figure out your various setup things or whatever. And then you're not the one who needs to either edit or outsource that editing, do all of the tech management or whatever. You are showing up. So you can dip your toe into whether you like, 5 different people's formats. You can try them out because you're the guest. Obviously it's a slightly different experience, but it allows you to dabble a little bit without feeling like you're making a big commitment. And then sometimes sometimes it's just as simple as like telling people that you are launching a podcast so that you have to launch your podcast.
Exactly. I do that a lot. I'm like, I say I'm going to launch it on a certain date. And I'm like, oh, damn it. Now I really have to do it.
Yeah. No, I am very driven by urgency and deadlines, which is why I have changed a few things in my business in the last couple years to suit that, of like doing things more in person with people and setting deadlines rather than like having a mental deadline of when I'm going to get that to the client. I tell the client when I'm going to get it to them so that I am bound to that thing. I love accountability. It's a very large portion of things. And so sometimes that consistency for a podcast is just like announcing that you are going to have a podcast every 2 weeks, every week, whatever. Or that you're going to be releasing a season of 10 episodes, or that you're going to be doing, releasing this private podcast, and then embracing it and doing it. And then also just understanding that like if something happens and you decide you want to take a break from your podcast, that is okay. Rather than thinking, oh, but if I start this podcast now, then what happens in 6 months? When, like, don't think that far ahead. Maybe just see how it goes and get started. And
you're gonna need that data to make those decisions, right? If you make that decision now, you're basing yourself on nothing, absolutely nothing.
Exactly.
But in 6 months from now, after you've been doing this, then you have the data. Then you can make an informed decision. Does this make sense? Should I continue? Should I tweak it? Should I do bi-weekly instead of weekly? Whatever it is, you have the data and you can base yourself from real information instead of just shit that's going on in your brain, basically.
Exactly. Yes. And also there's that thing of like, what if X happens? But it's also like, what if it turns out better than you thought it ever could? So that won't happen if you don't like press record that first time and actually release the episodes. I've evolved the show a lot. Initially I started out with solo episodes, then I did a different season with interviews that was more like, how are you approaching email, how are you approaching social? And then basically it was overwhelming for me to hear all of that information, so I can only imagine what it was like for my listeners. And the episodes were well received and everything, but I just kind of thought like, for this new season, let's do something different. There was quite an extended break in between this season and last season, but it's okay. Life happens. That's fine. So, I've just been kind of approaching things as like, how can I make this slightly better over time? And just, how can I make this valuable for my listeners without it being this thing that becomes too intimidating for me that I just end up not doing it. So,
yes. Yeah. Oh my gosh. I'm so glad you touched on that topic, because it is important to enjoy recording your podcast. If you're like hating the experience, there's something very wrong. It shouldn't be that hard. It shouldn't be, I don't want to do this. It's the last thing on my list. I hate it. No, it shouldn't. It should be pleasurable in some way, either because you love connecting with guests and having conversations, either because you actually enjoy the experience of recording or planning the episodes, or the comments or DMs you get. I don't know, but you should take some pleasure out of it. If there's no pleasure, then I think there's something wrong and needs to be addressed.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, so I happen to be batching quite a lot of episodes. I'm like moving soon. There's this whole internet situation. So this is my 4th interview of the week. If I had hated doing this, could you imagine what this week would feel like? It would be the most intimidating, draining thing ever. And yes, it takes time. So I haven't gotten a lot of other work done this week, but that's okay because I love it. And also I just love knowing that I don't have to schedule a bunch of stuff for the next wee while. It's just like such a pressure off. But I so look forward to all of these conversations, and everyone is so different. And so, even if you don't have guests as your podcast, you can make it so that everything is enjoyable for you, and just like making a few adjustments. And over time, you'll either find what works for you in podcasting, or you'll find that podcasting wasn't maybe what you thought it was going to be, or something like that. And that's okay too. Yeah. Perfect. Sweet. Alrighty, well, let's wrap it up with some quick fire questions. Who inspires you in business?
This is gonna sound cliche, but it is my clients, actually, because I work with women only, and that is very inspiring to me, to see other women succeeding and learning and teaching and just growing their business, because it's lonely sometimes. I think you can relate to run your own business, especially online. Even if you have a team, you're not there with them, and it's not face to face. So yeah, just like whenever things get hard, I just look up to them, or I send them a message or an email, and it's always like the most inspiring, motivating thing to keep me going.
Yeah. No, same. Yeah, it might seem cliche, but that's always the answer that comes to mind for me, is who my clients are. I mean, I see people out there doing things that are inspiring, but my clients they inspire me in the details.
It's a deeper relationship, exactly, because it's hard to relate to, I don't know, Brené Brown. Oh, you know what I mean? But to my clients, it's easy to relate. Even if they're like 10 steps ahead of me or 100 steps ahead of me, I can still relate to their story and the business they're building. And yeah, I can't relate to Oprah. I can't.
No. And even hearing the origin story, I'm like, yeah, but it's,
it's still too far. Yeah, no.
Yeah, it's a different world back then, so it's a little unrelatable. Also, I don't know that I want Oprah's trajectory, quite frankly. That sounds terrifying, to be in front of that many people on stage. Yeah. The piece that I love about podcasting the most is that, yes, there are listeners, but it's just you and I in this conversation.
Mm-hmm. I'm with you.
Yeah. What creative pursuit are you enjoying or feeling drawn to right now in your work or personal life?
I'm going to choose personal, because I just started to do something really exciting. I'm learning Italian because I am weird. And I'm planning a trip to Italy, and I'm like, I want to be able to speak some Italian when I'm there. So I just started this online free Italian course. Let's see how that goes. I'm not making anyone any promises, but that's what I'm excited about at the moment.
Yeah. And also, even if you only know the basics, I'm sure it'll be a lot less intimidating when you get there, just to know that you can get by with a little bit of stuff. Yeah.
And everything sounds amazing in Italian. I don't know, but I love it.
Yeah. That's so cool. What is your favorite place on the internet right now?
I'm between two. I'm between LinkedIn, which I never thought I would say in my entire life, but LinkedIn and Threads. I am weirdly obsessed with Threads. It's probably the novelty of it, but I'm really enjoying LinkedIn, really. A lot of my clients are big on LinkedIn, so they are really the ones that kind of pushed me indirectly to try it again. I tried it like 10 years ago, and it was not great 10 years ago. But now it's a whole different world out there. And I'm actually enjoying creating content there and really networking, meeting people, having different types of conversation, because it's a different type of social platform. It's different. I don't know exactly how to explain it. It's so new to me still, because I just got back like a month ago. But it's different than what you do and what you see on Instagram or Facebook or Twitter. Threads is still new, so I'm not sure. But yeah, that's where I am now. I'm experimenting with LinkedIn and yeah, having fun with it.
Yeah, I like how social media is becoming more social and like human to human again. I really love that.
Mm-hmm.
And yes, some of that has been like a cultural shift, but I think the platforms are doing things to like purposefully make that happen. So I really love that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Especially Instagram became very overwhelming to me last year. And I'm like, we need to make a shift because it wasn't healthy for me anymore. And we still have to market our business, right? So I was like studying different ways and like we redid the whole marketing strategy. And now I'll be focusing a lot on podcast interviews because I really enjoy them, and LinkedIn because I think that's a better social platform. It's not really social, but I think you know what I mean. It's a better social platform for our business and our goals. And it takes a lot of the overwhelm out of it because it's like Instagram was a lot for me. It's just, there's too much going on.
Yeah, I think there's been like a general consensus of people loving like Threads, for example, because it's the Instagram, obviously it's made by Instagram and Facebook. But because it's text, they have to do less to show up and create content. I mean, I imagine that with commenting and things like that, it's kind of like the same input, really, because we were all just commenting in our pajamas anyway. But now we can do the whole thing in our pajamas, and it's just like so fun to have both one-on-one and like multi-person conversations through those places. And yeah, LinkedIn is becoming that as well. But yeah, I know what you mean by 5 to 10 years ago, LinkedIn was very different. So I hope it stays how it's going. I like it. What are you looking forward to the most in the next year of business?
I think collaborations and partnerships. I think the last few months I had to reassess a lot of things, and a lot of it was due to that social media overwhelm. So reassess that, and a lot of it also was just this feeling of like doing everything myself, and I have like being alone in this, that lonely feeling. So I think that's the way to go. Collaborations, partnerships. I just had a live yesterday and I felt so energized after the live. It's like talking to a human and talking about something you both enjoy. It's really different, and it gives you that motivation, to keep going. So collaborations and partnerships. That's my final answer.
Yeah, I love that. What are you looking forward to the most in the offline world this next year?
My trip to Italy.
Nice. I love that. Yeah. And then finally, the big question, if someone is listening to this episode and they want to grow their own business, what is the one thing you recommend they do or evaluate next?
Oh, that's a big question. I think because I went through this process not long ago, a couple months ago, I think really sitting down and saying what's working for you, especially, and what's not. Because like there's so much out there, right? We get bombarded with information. You should do this and that. This is a great strategy. It's so overwhelming, and sometimes we end up doing things that doesn't align with us, our values, or our goals, just because someone told you to. So really sitting down and giving your business an audit. What are the services you're offering, team members you have, clients you have, marketing, where are you showing up, your platforms, everything. Like, is it working? Is it not? Why is it not working? How does it feel? Like, just assessing everything. I think that's the best place to start. I could sit here and say, oh, you should do this, but it's really up to you. What works for you and what's sustainable going forward, because some things are not sustainable, especially if they don't feel good to you, and you're never gonna know until you sit down and with your feelings for a while and decide what's working and what's not working.
Yeah, exactly. That reflection is such a massive piece of all parts of business and also life. But just sitting down and creating space for yourself to give yourself the time to process all of your feelings and maybe uncover a few things that you haven't totally thought about is so important. So, yes. But thank you so much for having this chat with me. This is so amazing. I have so many ideas from this, and I'm sure the listeners will too.
Oh, great. I'm happy to hear that. Thank you so much for the opportunity. I really appreciate it. I know it's a lot of work behind a podcast, so I appreciate you.
Thank you for joining me for this episode of the Digital Hive podcast. If you're enjoying the podcast, I'd love it if you could share it with a friend or on Instagram and tag me at Honeypot Digital. To find out more about Honeypot Digital and the work I do, or to find more episodes of the podcast and handy tips for small businesses marketing online, head to honeypotdigital.com.